Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a full in-depth deck breakdown of a deck that I've recently used to hit rank 1 with on the Arena ladder. As you can see from the screenshot here, I'm currently 21-4 with this deck, so it's been performing really well for me. And now before I get into it, there's going to be an MTGA zone link down in the description. If you click on that, we'll have the full deck list there that you can import into your Arena if you want to try the deck out for yourself. And I'm also in the process of writing a full text article about this deck for MTGA Zone Premium that will have more details, a full sideboard guide, how I changed the deck for best of one, and some tips and tricks to help you play the deck as well. So as soon as that's finished and up, I'll link that down in the description as well. But anyway, with that all out of the way, this is my Dimir One Ring control deck in Historic. And this is definitely a control deck, but it's also kind of a tempo deck as well, because we're built to play at instant speed as often as possible. And the main reason for that is that I just feel like counter spells are pretty well positioned right now. I feel like the main threats in the format right now are the combo decks like Kethis and Revels and Samwise, where if you let the Kethis resolve, it can just win the game on the spot. Same thing with the Revels, if you can't counter that and they can untap, they can just win. And then there's obviously a bunch of cards from Samwise as well that if you let it resolve, allows them to combo off. And then the other main thing in the format is obviously the One Ring, right? This card is everywhere right now. A bunch of decks are trying to pair it with Shieldred, so I feel like counter spells are pretty well positioned right now, because being able to counter the One Ring before it resolves is the best way of dealing with it, because they don't get the protection and they don't get that first draw trigger either. So I've been trying a bunch of decks with counter spells. Obviously Blue-White Control has been around for a while, and I do think that deck is pretty decent still, but I feel like it's still very vulnerable to a deck like Humans, and there's no real good way around that. And I also feel like it's incredibly vulnerable to the new Orcish Bowmasters as well, that I'll get to later in the video. So I've been trying a bunch of decks that pair it with black, because I feel like the black removal and having access to Bowmasters is a really big deal right now. And so I was trying a bunch of Grixis Shell stuff with Crucius and Snapcaster Mage and Flame of Anor and counter spells, but I just felt like tapping out ever was super risky, right? If you tap out for a Crucius on turn 3, if you're going first, you give the opponent a chance to kill it. If you're going second, the opponent can just untap and cast their One Ring, which is an absolute nightmare. So the more I was playing with counter spells, the more I wanted to just be never tapping out, playing at instant speed, always holding up counter spells, and that's what led me to this specific deck, and I've been a really big fan of it so far. So as I said, the whole deck is basically built to play at instant speed, and the main reason why I'm interested in black rather than blue-white, first of all, is for Orcish Bowmasters. I think this card is phenomenal, and I also think it solves a lot of problems that Control has in general. So like I mentioned, I think one of the big weaknesses of blue-white Control is that it has a really horrendous matchup against Humans and Esper Sentinel decks in general, and Orcish Bowmasters really flips those matchups on their head, right? This card is so good against Esper Sentinel, being able to flash it in, not draw them a card because it's a creature, kills the Esper Sentinel, puts 2 bodies in play, is an absolute blowout against the Humans deck because so many of their creatures have 1 toughness. So if they have like an Esper Sentinel and another human, you can flash this in, kill the Sentinel, and then just block the other one in combat. There's also a bunch of other creatures. I mean, X1s in general are seeing less play because of Bowmasters, but this is still great against stuff like Dragon's Rage Channeler, against Mana Dorks from the Devotion decks as well. So there are a lot of really good targets for it, and very importantly, it's also good against other copies of Bowmasters. I think one of the other big weaknesses of Blue-White Control right now is that Bowmasters is really good against you, and it's hard to interact with, whereas kind of ironically, the best answer for Bowmasters is a Bowmasters itself. So even though this deck is definitely vulnerable to Bowmasters because you are a control deck, and basically all of our threats outside of Hall of Storm Giants are also X1s, we have our own Bowmasters to answer the opponents. And just in general, you know, having this card as in a flash shell is so powerful, right? You know, being able to hold open interaction and then flash in a Bowmasters if the opponent doesn't do anything is so good. So the fact that the whole deck outside of the One Ring can play at instant speed really maximizes the utility that we can get off Bowmasters. Then obviously the other big advantage of this is it's really good against decks that are trying to draw as part of their game plan. So obviously the main thing is the One Rings everywhere right now, and so Bowmasters is a really good counter to the One Ring. So not only do we have counter spells, but if the opponent does manage to get into a spot where they resolve their One Ring, we also have Bowmasters to punish that, which is really huge. And then there are also a number of other decks that draw as part of the game plan. You know, like I said, against Control, you know, this is great as well. So we have an edge in the control mirror matches because we have our own Bowmasters, and just in general, you know, we're a flash deck. So being able to flash in stuff like Brazen Borrower or Snapcaster Mage, play on the opponent's end step, really, you know, makes it hard for them to deal with us. So I feel like because we've got Bowmasters, we improve matchups against other control decks as well, which is really huge. And then there are obviously some other decks that draw as part of their game plan. You know, Izzet Wizards has a bunch of cantrips, as does Phoenix, and decks like Auras as well. So Bowmasters just such a powerful card on rate, but is very good against the Esper Sentinel decks, very good against any decks with X1s, and just fits so well into this deck because we're playing at instant speed. The other really nice advantage of this is we also run Make Disappear, which has Casualty, and so we can make really good use of the extra token that it creates as well. So I feel like this is probably the best Bowmasters deck I've played because we're always playing at instant speed. It helps improve matchups that are otherwise difficult, and also maximizes Make Disappear as well. And we've also got Snapcaster Mage, which is really effective in this deck because we have so much cheap, efficient interaction as well. You know, one of the main reasons why I'm really big on this list as opposed to Blue-White Control is because I feel like it maximizes the One Ring a lot better. Whenever I play with Blue-White Control, I felt like I was discarding to hand size a lot because you obviously draw a ton of cards off the One Ring, but since most of the cards in Blue-White Control are more expensive in general, you end up with a hand full of slightly more expensive cards. You can't really empty your hand as effectively, whereas this deck, the curve is so much lower, so we can very effectively cast everything that we find off the One Ring without having to discard to hand size. And the other nice upside of One Ring in Dimir is that Dimir doesn't really have good options at the top end, right? Blue-White Control has Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and there is definitely an argument between those two cards. Obviously, One Ring is incredibly powerful, but if you are discarding to hand size all the time, and you do risk having to tap out and not having that untapped mana to protect like Teferi has, there is definitely some tension between wanting to run One Ring and wanting to run Teferi, whereas in Dimir you don't really have good options at the top end, so having access to the One Ring here is really huge. But anyway, back to Snapcaster Mage, kind of got sidetracked there. This card is so good in the deck because we have so much cheap, cantrips and interaction. We've got Consider, which means that we effectively always have a draw spell off the Snapcaster Mage, even on turn 3, which is huge. Fatal Push is obviously great as well. Then it also works pretty well with Make Disappear. At a pinch, if we do need to use the Casualty mode, we can obviously flash in the Snapcaster Mage and sacrifice it to the Make Disappear that we flash back to counter something if the opponent doesn't have 4 or more mana, which is pretty huge as well. So Snapcaster Mage, really, really effective as both a threat and a way to ensure that we don't run out of interaction as well. And then we've also got Brazen Borrower, so I think this is probably the closest to a flex slot in the deck, and it is pretty annoying that it does die to Bowmasters, but I feel like this is probably the best out of the options. So in terms of alternatives, if you're not a big fan of Brazen Borrower, I think you do want this to be a threat, and you do want it to be instant speed as well, because like I said, one of the big strengths of this deck is it does play at instant speed all the time. So the other two cards that you could consider in this spot are Kaleem and Shark Typhoon, but I do feel like Brazen Borrower is pretty important and definitely has been my favourite, but even though it does die to August Bowmasters, if this was a 3-2, I think it would be a slam dunk and there would be no question about whether this is the best option in the slot. But the main reasons why I'm really high on Brazen Borrower is first of all because of the One Ring. There will be some hands where we just have to slam this on turn 4 and hope the opponent doesn't have anything, and being in Dimir, we don't have good answers to stuff like artifacts, so if we tap out for the One Ring and then the opponent has something like a Pithing Needle, without Brazen Borrower we have no way to answer that. Similarly, if the opponent plays like an Unlicensed Hearse to shut off our Snapcaster Mage, we don't really have good ways to answer that as well. So Brazen Borrower is really nice to give us insurance against permanents that we struggle to deal with if we do have to tap out for the One Ring. So say we do go One Ring and we activate it, and then the opponent untaps and plays a Pithing Needle, we can then play Brazen Borrower to bounce it and then counter it again when the opponent tries to cast it, which is a really important play pattern. The other nice thing about Brazen Borrower is it acts as additional interaction. One of the downsides of both Kaleem and Shark Typhoon is that they don't enable us to interact on turn 2, whereas Borrower is really sick. Even if we're on the draw, if the opponent taps out for a Crucius or a Jarstel or something, being able to bounce it with Brazen Borrower if we have like an Archmage's Charm in hand is really sick at just buying us time to then just counter it the following turn. Like I said, a lot of decks right now are just playing at sorcery speed, are just playing one card per turn, and being able to just bounce something to buy us some time, this deck does often play like a tempo deck, is really sick. And then speaking of that, the other really big advantage of this is it allows us to just start turning the corner and closing games out. Being able to just flash this in as a 3-1 and start closing the game out when we are a relatively threat-light deck is very important. So the downsides of the other cards, Kaleem is the other card, one of the other cards that I think you could potentially run in this spot. Main reason, I am very high on this in Control in general, but I don't think it really fits in this shell because of Snapcaster Mage, right? If you run Kaleem alongside Snapcaster Mage, first of all, I feel like if you're running Kaleem, you should be running 4 copies because it's a card you want to draw in multiples so that you can bring it back as a 5-6 as quickly as possible, but it still doesn't play around Bowmasters particularly well because it still triggers it. It doesn't count as interaction interaction on turn 2, you know, if the opponent does play a Crucius when you're on the draw, for example, you know, they still get the trigger, so Kaleem doesn't really do anything in that spot. And the other thing is, you know, as I mentioned, we're a Dimir deck, so we don't really have good ways to deal with artifacts. So if we're running Kaleem and Snapcaster Mage, if the opponent manages to get an Unlicensed Hearse in play before we can counter it, then both our Kaleem and our Snapcaster Mage are completely turned off, which is really rough. So I'm not a big fan of Kaleem for that reason. And then Shark Typhoon is a reasonable card, but again, doesn't act as interaction on turn 2, whereas Borrower does. And it's just generally quite slow as well, right? If you do cycle this on turn 3, if the opponent does have a Bowmasters, that's again a real blowout because they can just kill the tokens. So even though you do have some other options, I think Brazen Borrower is the best that we have, even though it does die to Bowmasters. Speaking of which, though, we can just kill the opposing Bowmasters with our own, or we do have a lot of cheap interaction, particularly post-sideboard, so I've not felt it's that much of an issue, and Borrower has felt very important, particularly at closing games out. Now, one thing you might notice with the gameplay that's coming up later is that I was originally running 4 copies of Brazen Borrower, but I was only running 22 lands back then, and I do feel like that was too few. You know, missing land drops is a big deal in this deck, particularly because we've got Snapcaster Mage, which often wants us to have 5 mana, for example. We need to hit our 4th land for the One Ring as well, so I ended up trimming the 4th Brazen Borrower to make room for the 23rd land, but I think this card is pretty good, even though it does die to Bowmasters at just closing games out. Then in terms of the instants and sorceries that we've got in the deck, we've got Consider, which is really nice with Snapcaster Mage, right? You know, I felt like I really wanted a 1-mana cantrip to ensure that Snapcaster always had something good to do, even on turn 3, which is huge. And since we are a control deck with, you know, we've only got 23 lands, running 4 Consider basically enables us to do that pretty consistently, right? Because the Surveil is very good at helping us find lands. It can also bin instants and sorceries for us to use with Snapcaster Mage later. We have Cling to Dust, which has Escape, so we do get some utility off the Surveil in some spots as well. But Consider, just good with Snapcaster Mage and just good at ensuring that we keep hitting land drops as well. Then we've also got Fatal Push here. You know, every black control deck is going to be running Fatal Push. Very good as early interaction. I feel like having turn 1 interaction is particularly important right now against decks like Mono Green Devotion. Just killing their 1-drops is very important there, and specifically against Izzet Wizards as well. Having 1-mana interaction is very important there to ensure you don't get run over. Then we've got 2 copies of Cling to Dust, which I'm really impressed with this card, and this is basically main deck Graveyard Hate that also provides us with some incidental life gain with the One Ring. So most people running the One Ring are trying to pair it with Shieldred right now, which is a sick combo, but Shieldred is super vulnerable to interaction. I feel like people are clocking onto that, and a lot of people are running interaction in their deck. As I mentioned, I want basically every single card in this deck to be at instant speeds, other than the One Ring, obviously, which is sorcery speed. And having Cling to Dust basically means that we don't have to rely on Shieldred. Like I said, Shieldred is not only requires us to tap out, which is not what this deck wants to be doing, but it's also vulnerable to loads of interaction, particularly when Fatal pushes everywhere right now. So Cling to Dust is really nice because it does provide us with incidental life gain, and 3 life is a lot, you know. So when pairing this with the One Ring is really good at ensuring that we don't get burnt out by it until we can find a second copy, and then we can obviously just legend roll it. So very good with the incidental life gain. Incidental Graveyard Hate is also very good against a number of decks right now, like Kethis and Reanimator and stuff like that, and it's just useful as a draw spell as well, right? We fill our graveyard up pretty quickly, so if we are just passing with mana up and the opponent doesn't do anything, we can just escape this, help us draw another card, which is really sick. So Cling to Dust, very good, and if I had an extra slot in the deck, I would probably go up to the 3rd Cling to Dust because it has been so nice in conjunction with the One Ring. Then we've got Make Disappear, which is my 2-mana counter spell of choice. Now, Change the Equation is a card that I've got in the sideboard, and I was very high on this in the main deck in the past, but the main reason why I've made this swap here is because Change the Equation can't hit the One Ring, which is one of the main reasons why I'm running counter spells in general right now. And I really like Make Disappear in this particular deck because on turn 2 it counters everything, right? Even if you're on the draw, it counters Crucius, it counters Fable, and it's just really good, you know, early in the game. And then because we have the tokens from Bowmasters, because we have Snapcaster Mage, we can fairly consistently use the casualty on this, so it does become pretty effective in the mid to late game as well. So big fan of Make Disappear because it is a catch-all. It can hit all the combo cards like Kethis and Revels, but it can also be used to hit the One Ring, which definitely gives it the edge over Change the Equation in my opinion. And we've got Heartless Act as an additional interaction, and I felt like it is very important to have kind of like a catch-all answer as removal, right? Previous builds of Control where you're just running stuff like Fatal Push and Molten Impact, you're really vulnerable to bigger creatures, so I wanted to have Heartless Act as a catch-all answer. Now, this doesn't hit everything, specifically against humans because of Thalia's Lieutenant. This does have a kind of a blind spot there, but I feel like out of the 2-mana kind of black generic interaction, it is the best option because I think the only other viable one is Go for the Throat, which is obviously pretty terrible against the artifact decks, which is still around right now. So I feel like Heartless Act is the best of the bunch, and specifically against humans, with we're very good against them because of Bowmasters, Fatal Push, and Cut Down post sideboard as well. So even though you are kind of blind in that matchup because of Thalia's Lieutenant, I still feel like Heartless Act is the best option that we have at the 2-mana slot because of that. And then we've also got Archmage's Charm, which is the big reason to be in just blue-black. You know, to be able to cast triple blue for this, I don't think you can really afford to be in more than 2 colours, especially if you're running, you know, 1-mana black spells as well. But Archmage's Charm just gives us additional counter spells, gives us additional utility. I think this card is really, really good in general, obviously. You know, the flexibility on this is great. Being able to steal permanents with 1 or less is very good in matchups where we might otherwise struggle, like against the Retrofitter Foundry decks. Being able to steal their 4/4s or Foundries with this is really big. So Archmage's Charm is a really big reason to stay in blue-black, and I think is, you know, one of the big cornerstones of this deck, particularly with Snapcaster Mage as well. And then the One Ring at the top end of this deck is really what makes this deck tick. This is basically our deck's version of Teferi, and like I mentioned, one of the main reasons why I'm really high on Dimir as opposed to blue-white is because the curve is so much lower, so we can very easily just use our spells very effectively, not have to discard to hand size, which was a big issue that I was having in the blue-white control deck, and it's just obviously just one of the most insane cards in the format. And I think this is one of the decks that capitalizes it on the best, because blue-black generally doesn't have a card like this at the top end that enables you to play into the long game. And because so much of our interaction is very cheap as well, even if we are behind on board, we can play the One Ring, stabilizes us for a turn because of the protection, and then because we have so much cheap interaction, we can often pick apart the opponent's board even if they have a bunch of threats in play. Then in terms of the mana base, as I mentioned, we've only got 23 lands, which is obviously very low for a control deck, but we're kind of a tempo deck as well. The curve of the deck is very low, and we also have 4 considered 2 Cling to Dust as cantrips in the early game. Archmage's Charm can obviously draw us 2 as well, so 23 has felt like a good amount overall. In terms of the actual lands themselves, we have a lot of blue-black dual lands, because obviously, you know, we need black on turn 1 for Fatal Push and Cut Down post sideboard, but we also need triple blue on turn 3 as consistently as possible. So obviously the pure blue black dual lands make sense. Shipwreck Marsh I feel is very important to consistently have the triple blue, but also have black when we need it. But obviously you don't want to go overboard on this because it's going to be entering tapped in the first few turns. The Pathway is the most awkward of the lands because you really want to be playing this on blue as often as possible, otherwise it cuts you off playing Archmage's Charm on turn 3. But it's better than other options because, you know, if we are in a spot where we do have to play this on black to be able to cast a Fatal Push on turn 1, for example, it's important to have access to. But note that if you have another land that can produce black, you should almost always put this on blue so that you have triple blue on turn 3 for Archmage's Charm. So definitely the most awkward of the lands, but I feel like it's still important to have here because of the fixing. The Notawara is basically free to run as a one-of, and then Hall of Storm Giants is really nice because it gives us another way to close games out. You know, as you can see, we are a relatively threat-light deck because we have only Bowmasters, Snapcaster Mage, and Brazen Borrower as ways to close the game out. So having Hall of Storm Giants is a particularly effective way once we have stabilized, because, you know, this deck is very good at slowing the opponent down, running them out of resources, and then, you know, ensuring that we just have a handful of interactions. So it's not too hard for us to get to the point where we have enough interaction up or the opponent taps out and we can just close the game out with Hall. So very important as a finisher here, but I don't think you really want to be running more than 2 because entering tap later in the game, especially if you need Archmage's Charm mana on turn 3, is a little bit awkward. And then a couple of basics just to round the mana base out. You know, we are a 2-color deck, and I still see Field of Ruin, I still see Assassin's Trophy occasionally, so I think the basics are important to run here. So that's the main deck overall. You know, as I said, I feel like counter spells are really good against a lot of the metagame right now, and I feel like, you know, this deck in particular is very nice because it kind of plays like a tempo deck. It's very low to the ground, so it plays very effectively with the One Ring as well. I feel like Cling to Dust is a really nice alternative to ensure that we don't get burnt out by the One Ring without having to run something like Shielded, which is a little bit awkward in this style of deck. So I've been really happy with the deck overall. So next up we'll have a look at the sideboard, starting off here with the 3rd copy of Cling to Dust. So this is here for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's just extra graveyard hate, which is especially important against the decks that are built heavily around the graveyard, like Reanimator, for example. But it's also just pretty nice against decks that have smaller graveyard synergies. So for example, if you're up against a mid-range deck that's running Croxo or Dreadhorde Arcanist, this is really nice to have access to. Not as good against Kethis combo, because Kethis generally cares about a high density of cards in the graveyard, rather than trying to, you know, snipe specific stuff. But against Kethis, we normally beat them with counter spells rather than Cling to Dust anyway, so not as important there. And then the other reason I bring this in is also for any matchups where I just want some extra incidental life gain, particularly against aggro, to help offset the life loss from the One Ring and to just put games out of reach. So Cling to Dust, really nice as the 3rd copy there. Then we got 4 copies of Cut Down, which is a card I've been kind of iffy on in the past, but I feel is really well positioned against a lot of the creature decks right now. So for example, against the Lurrus Humans deck, this hits basically everything in their deck, including Lurrus, which is a big deal. Against Goblins, similarly hits everything in the deck outside of Muxus, and can trade trade up with War Chief, which is really nice. Hits basically everything in the Samwise combo deck as well, you know, outside of Yawgmoth, but this can also trade up with Woe Strider, can kill all their Blood Artists and their Mana Dorks and stuff. And very importantly, it's also a good one to have against Kethis, because like I just mentioned, the main way we're beating Kethis is with counter spells, and the main way they can counteract that is with Delighted Halfling. If they can play Delighted Halfling on turn 1, that basically just shuts off our counter spells for the rest of the game. So having Cut Down in addition to Fatal Push basically maximises our chances of having an answer for the opponent's Halfling, and it also kills basically every other creature in their deck outside of Kethis, right? It can kill Kinnan, it can kill Rona, it can kill Emry, so I do feel like this is really well positioned right now. And it pairs very nicely with Snapcaster Mage as well because it's so cheap. Speaking of which, I think one of the other upsides of Snapcaster in this deck is that it really maximises your sideboard cards because you get to cast them all twice. So the other cards in the sideboard are all counter spells, and the main reason for that is that if you look at the main deck, you can see we've got 4 Fatal Push, 4 Heartless Act, which is largely dead in the control mirror matches, so I wanted to have a lot of cards to bring in against control. So in the control mirror match, I typically board in 2 Bind to Secrecy, 2 Spell Pierce, 2 Mystical Dispute, and a single Cling to Dust, which is good against both Kaleem and Snapcaster Mage. And then I'll keep in 1 of Fatal Push or Heartless Act, depending on if the opponent's running Kaleem or not. It's also important to be able to kill opposing Hall of Storm Giants as well. In terms of those counter spells themselves, Bind to Secrecy is essentially just a negate with upside. You know, if we have 5 or more mana values, we get a free card from the spellbook, and you do get the option of potentially conjuring a card from the graveyard into your hand, or a creature. Very rarely comes up, but it's nice upside to have. And then Spell Pierce and Mystical Dispute are really nice in the mirror match as well. You know, going for a 2-2 split here because I think Spell Pierce is really nice at stopping non-blue proactive plays. So for example, if you're against Creativity, for example, being able to use this to stop a Creativity for 2 mana is great. For 1 mana is great. And then Mystical Dispute is generally better at fighting on the stack because it's 1 mana and, you know, the opponent has to pay 3 rather than 2. And the other nice upside of Dispute is that you can also bring it in against blue creature decks as well, stuff like Merfolk or Spirits, for example. But it is slightly more awkward against non-blue proactive plays, so that's why I've gone for the 2-2 split. And again, I've been a big fan of it. Nice to have a split here as well with Snapcaster Mage, so liking that. Then the other card in the sideboard is Change the Equation, which isn't a card I bring in against control because it has just way too many cards that it misses, but there are a ton of other matchups where Change the Equation is really good. First of all, against any Lurrus deck, this is great because it hits basically everything in the deck outside of Lurrus. And then outside of that, it's just really good against red or green decks in general. You know, against Mono Green Devotion, this hits everything in their deck outside of Karn. Against Goblins, this hits, you know, their Revels and their Muxus and basically every single card in their deck as well. And then you can also consider bringing this in against the Jund or Rakdos midrange decks because it can hit all of their proactive 3-mana plays as well as stopping their discard spells. The awkward thing about Change the Equation in midrange is that it doesn't stop the One Ring, it doesn't stop Shieldred, and it's also quite hard to find room. So if you're up against a midrange deck that's not running Bowmasters, for example, you could consider cutting your own Bowmasters, because outside of killing opposing Bowmasters, it's really not that great in the matchup. You know, it doesn't have a ton of utility. I guess it's also very good against Seasoned Pyromancer, so it depends on their exact build, but if you feel like you can cut Bowmasters, Change the Equation is just a nice option to guarantee that you can stop their Cruciuses or their Jarsols even when you're going second. So that's the deck. Like I said, I've been really happy with it. I think, you know, being able to play a low to the ground deck that can play at instant speed, especially with counter spells, is really good against both the combo decks and the opposing One Ring decks. I think Bowmasters is a really sick card right now, and this is probably the best shell to enable Bowmasters because you're playing at instant speed almost the whole time, because, you know, you're a control deck, so it's particularly good against Esper Sentinel and Thalia. You can make use of the token because of Make Disappear as well. And I also feel like it's one of the decks that benefits the most from the One Ring because, as I said, Blue-Black doesn't really have good options for a late-game card advantage engine, and because your deck is so low to the ground, you can basically always cast everything you draw off it, unlike Blue-White Control where you often have to discard to hand size. In terms of weaknesses of the deck, even though we do have our own Bowmasters and cheap interaction to be able to kill the opponent's Bowmasters, all of our threats outside of Hall of Storm Giants do have 1 toughness, so we are definitely still vulnerable to Bowmasters. We do have ways to kill it, but that's definitely one weakness of the deck. And then second of all, I think it is quite a difficult deck to play, right? I think Control and Tempo are both quite tricky to play anyway, and this is a deck where you really need to know what to hold your counter spells and interaction for, but it's still been so much fun. The other slightly annoying thing is that the matchup against Rakdos and Jund midrange can come down to top decks quite often, but I think that's the case with most decks, right? They have discard spells, but thankfully we do have the One Ring, which is a really sick top deck against them. So that matchup can be a bit of a coin flip depending on how each player's interaction lines up against each other. But overall, I really like how this deck is positioned, and it's been a ton of fun to play as well. So anyway, next up, I've got some gameplay so you guys can see the deck in action. Just got some matches that I was playing on the ladder. Give me a shout in the comments if you've got any questions about the deck at all, and I hope you enjoy the gameplay. Big up. Okay, so we're going second here. And yeah, this hand looks great, right? We've got early interaction, early ways to filter, and Snapcaster Mage as well. So very happy to keep this one. See what the opponent's on here. Seachrome Coast, so probably either Affinity or Control, if I had to guess. Probably Control, because most of the artifact decks are using Lurrus now. So we'll consider here. I think Brazen Borrower is good against either the artifact deck or Control, so happy to keep that one, and then we'll just pass it back here. The fact the opponent hasn't really done anything so far probably makes me think they're on Control, but the fact they have double white means we don't have to worry about Archmage's Charm, which is pretty nice. So I'm going to fire off the Consider here. Happy to keep a land because, you know, we want to try and hit 4 lands for Snapcaster Mage to be able to flash back some of the 2-mana spells, and then Make Disappear is a really sick one. So now we have counter spells that we can also flash back with Snapcaster. And I think I'm just happy to run out the Brazen Borrower here, right? I want to start applying pressure. I do think we have a pretty big edge in these control mirror matches because we essentially play like a tempo deck. We're playing entirely instant speed, and we have a lot of threats that we can flash in during the opponent's end step. So I feel like we do have a pretty good matchup, but we do need to apply pressure. They generally have the better late game if the game goes really long, so the onus is definitely on us to start applying pressure now. Speaking of which, I'm just going to flash in the Snapcaster Mage now, try and flash back the Consider, see if the opponent wants to do anything about that, because that does speed up our clock quite a lot. Okay, they do have to change the equation, so unfortunately we also don't really, since we're playing almost entirely instant speed, outside of the One Ring, we don't really have good ways to punish them for tapping out. And then even if we do tap out for the One Ring early, that then, gives the opponent a window to resolve a Teferi or One Ring of their own. So we don't have too many ways to punish the opponent for using counter spells during their end step, but they don't know that, and they typically don't want to risk doing that either. Wow, they just jammed the One Ring. I mean, I'm pretty happy to fire that off. I guess since, they haven't seen any counter spells so far, they might even think we're just playing a tempo deck without counter spells, right? They don't really know what deck we're on. Wow, opponent just scoops it up. I mean, I guess them tapping out, getting the One Ring countered, and then us just applying more pressure is going to probably be too much for them. So anyway, sideboarding here is pretty simple. We bring in the extra counter spells that are good in the matchup, and I want to cut the Heartless Act and Fatal Push. I also think Cling to Dust is pretty good against basically every control variant right now, because the One Ring variants are running Snapcaster Mage, the non-One Ring variants are running Kaleem, and Cling to Dust is very good against both of those. Whether I keep in Fatal Push or Heartless Act generally depends on if they're playing Kaleem or not. If they are playing Kaleem, then I generally like keeping Heartless Act in because, that's a threat they can get into play even through our counter spells. So I typically like to keep in one Heartless Act over Fatal Push, but if I haven't seen Kaleem, I prefer Fatal Push just because it's a more efficient answer to stuff like, Snapcaster Mage, Hall of Storm Giants, and the tokens off Wandering Emperor and Shark Typhoon as well. But either way, this matchup has felt really good to me in testing because we are basically playing a tempo deck against Control, which is typically a good matchup. So I can't keep a one-lander without any cantrips. This I think we can keep though. We've got early interaction in the Fatal Push, in the Mystical Dispute. Wow, they have Leyline of Sanctity. I guess they don't know that we're not on Fatal Push, so that essentially does nothing against us apart from it does shut off the damage from Orcish Bowmasters, which is a little bit annoying, so gonna run out of land here and just ship it back. And then if the opponent doesn't do anything, I think I might bounce the Leyline of Sanctity. Now again, like I said, it doesn't really bother us that much, but not doing this, just doesn't utilize our mana. I feel like I might as well. And then, this does then open up Orcish Bowmasters to be a lot more effective against them. Okay, they do have the Dispute, but I'm pretty happy with that exchange because I feel like if they used Dispute on the front side, they would probably have just used Dispute on the 3-1 if I had flashed it in this turn anyway. So that's not a huge deal really, I don't think. Does mean that Orcish Bowmasters isn't as good, but I still think it's pretty good overall. So, going to play the Hall of Storm Giants tapped here, while we have the opportunity. Obviously, we do have One Ring, but I think I want to wait until I have multiple counter spells. So, again, could jam the One Ring here with Spell Pierce or Dispute back up, but I think I'd rather wait a turn until I have both Spell Pierce and Dispute, and then I either have two pieces of, two counter spells to fight on the stack, or potentially, one counterspell to fight on the stack and another counterspell to fight during the opponent's turn. So let's see what they've got here. I feel like we should be able to force through this One Ring. Okay, Snapcaster Mage, so they only got Mystical Dispute in the graveyard, so we could obviously counter the Snapcaster Mage, but I think I'm actually pretty happy to let this resolve, because if they do use the Dispute, they end up tapping out. So then we can just use one of our 2 counter spells now, and then just use the other one later, which, well, have it up during the opponent's turn, which seems pretty sick. So, okay, so they do tap out for the Dispute, so I think I'm going to Spell Pierce this, and then we can hold up Dispute for the opponent's turn, although... Actually, no, I think that was a mistake, because the 2 things we're worried about here are Teferi and One Ring, and Mystical Dispute doesn't stop the One Ring. So if they don't have... Okay, I mean, they had a land, and they did have Teferi, so if they hadn't had a land, then Spell Pierce would have been better to stop the One Ring. Oh, they just scoop it up. I mean, yeah, we were in a pretty sick position, but Control in general has felt like a really good matchup to me so far. Okay, so we're going second here. And yeah, I think I'm pretty happy to keep this. Shipwreck Marsh being tapped is a little bit annoying, but we do have Consider to dig for it. With Consider, I'm going to play this land untapped. This could be an issue, though, because if the opponent plays a threat here, we might have to push it, and then if we end up... Yeah, okay, so they got Harvester. I mean, there's an argument to going for Consider here. I think I might have been greedy playing that Underground River untapped, because now if we don't draw an untapped land... Yeah, now we don't have Heartless Act up for their Crucius turn, so I think I might have already misplayed. I think I probably should have played that Shipwreck Marsh tapped. Yeah, now they have Crucius, so that's pretty rough. Maybe I should have also... Yeah, if I'd considered, I would have found the untapped land, so maybe I should have let the Harvester live and gone for Consider, but then we get super punished if we don't find a land off it, so... I think I definitely misplayed there somewhat. I either should have played the Shipwreck Marsh tapped or probably should have used Consider instead of the Fatal Push, because now they've got... Like, we obviously can kill the Crucius here, but then the opponent knows that the shields are down for them to be able to cast a One Ring or something. If they have a second Crucius in hand, they still get another trigger, so... Yeah, I think I probably should... On balance, I probably should have played the Marsh tapped. Okay, thankfully they didn't have a crazy strong... follow-up, so we weren't massively punished there. They still got that first Crucius trigger, though, which we could have avoided. So yeah, I think on balance I probably should have played the Marsh tapped, but I think it's still alright here. Now, I think with our hand as it is, without counter spells, you know, there is an argument to playing slower to stop the opponent being able to untap and play their One Ring, but... You know, with no counter spells, I think I'm happy to just run it out here. And we do have 2 Orcish Bowmasters, so even if the opponent does have a One Ring of their own, we have 2 Bowmasters to punish that. If I had counter spell in hand, then I'm not sure I would play the One Ring there. I think I'd play it a little bit slower, because ideally I would like to, you know, keep playing until I find a One Ring and counter spells to back it up to stop the opponent. Thankfully, I don't have a One Ring of their own, though, so... we do draw a Snapcaster Mage. Unfortunately, we can't just cleanly kill this Scavenging Ooze with the Bowmasters here, because they've got 2 green spare here, so a little bit awkward, because the Ooze also shuts off our ability to use Snapcaster Mage here. Interesting to see what the opponent does here, though. Okay, they loot away a removal spell, which is fine. Keep up 2 green still. So, I mean, if they tapped out of green, I'll definitely flash in the Bowmasters in response to be able to kill the Ooze here. Okay, they tap out of 1. I still don't think that's safe, though, because if we do flash in both Bowmasters here, they can just use the treasure to exile a creature from their graveyard. You know, we could potentially try and go... No, if we had 6 mana, there's an argument to maybe going Snapcaster Mage to bait out the Scavenging Ooze activation and then kill it with 2 Bowmasters, but then that taps us out and we can't use the Make Disappear, so... Interesting that I guess they didn't want to burn a treasure on the Ooze. Wow, okay, they just go for the Hive here. Interesting spot. So we can obviously go Snapcaster Fatal Push, which then would bait them out to use the Ooze activation here. But I think I'm not going to do that. I think I'm going to let them attack first because, you know, we don't have a way to kill the Scavenging Ooze. If, like I said, if we had 6 mana, we could go Snapcaster Mage and then, you know, bait it out, then double Bowmasters. Instead here, I think I'm going to go for the Bowmasters, deal damage to the Scavenging Ooze, and then just try and block it. And if they do use the Ooze activation to exile the creature from their graveyard, we can just flash in the second Bowmasters, deal 1 damage directly to them, and then turn our Orc Army into a 2/2 to still trade. Yeah, okay, so they burn their treasure. So I'm pretty happy with this exchange. They do obviously exile a card from our graveyard, but we got rid of the Ooze, which was making our hand with Snapcaster Mage a little bit awkward. And we get to fire off a Consider here as well. Yeah, I think I'll take a second One Ring, right? Eventually, you do need to Legend rule the One Ring, right? We're not running Shieldred, so we don't have that crazy endgame set up. But yeah, we're just pulling really far ahead here because of the One Ring, so we get to get in with both Bowmasters. Yeah, I definitely did play in the early game, and we could have got punished if the opponent had a second Crucius or a One Ring, so I am a little bit annoyed about that. I'm going to watch it back and see what the best line was, but thankfully we didn't get punished, and we're in a really good position now. Okay, they thought Seize. I mean, I think I'm just going to let them see my hand here, right? No matter what they take, we're in a great position here. I think they're probably more incentivized to maybe take the One Ring, because that then opens up the possibility that we might end up dying to our own ring here, which is what they do, makes sense, but I don't know. We've got Cling to Dust, we've still got 2 more copies of Ring in the deck, and we could just stop drawing as well. You know, it's at 3, so we've got at least 4 turns, and we should be able to close the game out, so I'm not too worried. Molten Impact is a little bit awkward. Unfortunately, we can't bounce our own creature with Brazen Borrower. That could be a cool line to do. Oh, okay, opponent just scoops it up. Yeah, we were so far ahead that I think we would have won that regardless. So here's an interesting matchup. We didn't see Bowmasters from the opponent, and they're on Jund, so they might not be running Bowmasters. Plus, we have our own interaction for it. If we do see Bowmasters going into game 3, then I think I'd keep my own copies in of it. But I want to bring in the Cling to Dust here because it's going to be good against Jarsil, which I have to assume they're going to be running if they're in Jund. Just trying to think whether I want the 4th Fatal Push or not, because it is good against... It's probably slightly better against Jund because they run more 2-drops typically. They've got the Ooze. They might be running Tarmogoyf as well. And, I think... Just trying to think what the last cut should be here. Maybe we don't need the Cling to Dust, to be honest, because we've not seen Croxer. Cling to Dust also isn't great against Jarsil if they have multiple 1-drops in their graveyard, so I think I'm going to run it back like that. Again, sideboarding against midrange is tricky because Bowmasters isn't very good against them unless they're running their own Bowmasters, so that's typically a card I would prefer to replace with Change the Equation, but if they are running Bowmasters, having it as an extra way to kill it is nice to have access to. This hand isn't amazing, but I mean it's got cantrips and One Ring and interaction, so it's fine, but I don't really want to be mulliganing at all against the Thoughtseize deck. Okay, so they do take the One Ring, so we have run out of top end slightly, but we have a lot of cantrips here. Okay, they do just tap out for Harvest. They're definitely just going to fire off the Fatal Push here. And then hopefully we draw a 2-mana counter spell here, or they do potentially have access to... Oh, okay, so we drew Heartless Axe, so now we have an answer to Crucius, which is really huge. You know, that's one of the other things I tried to do when building this deck, is to just maximize my answers for a turn 3 Crucius, even when we're on the draw. So we get to Heartless Axe the Crucius here, which is a great exchange for us. And we do Make Disappear. Okay, perfect. Going to keep playing these pathways on blue because I want to have Archmage's Charm mana available, obviously. Okay, opponent shocks it in. They do have Jarsil, but we have the Make Disappear here, thankfully. So we get to counter that. And we get to consider here. So at this point, we're just digging towards more... You know, late game gas or counter spells. If we can find Archmage's Charm, that's great. If we can find a One Ring, that's great. Snapcaster Mage would also be great. Okay, perfect. Found an Archmage's Charm. So that's more insurance for in case they play anything problematic at all. We've also got Heartless Axe, so if they do play land, fire up the Hive, we have an answer to that as well. And we've obviously got the Consider to keep things ticking over. So definitely like our position here. Okay, Tarmogoyf is interesting. I think I'm more interested in using the Heartless Act on that. I'd rather save the Archmage's Charm for something like a One Ring. So definitely just going to Heartless Act the Tarmogoyf and then fire off Consider here, see what we hit. Okay, perfect. Snapcaster Mage is a great one here as well. Okay, and another Archmage's Charm. So we are choked on mana a little bit, so I might end up drawing 2 off Archmage's Charm if they don't do anything crazy this turn, but I feel like we're in a pretty sick spot here. Okay, they fire up Hive, so we can just kill that, and to be honest, I don't hate that. I'm going to use the Snapcaster Mage now, because this not only kills the Hive, which denies them a mana, and shuts it off for the rest of the game. Oh, they just scoop up. Sweet. I mean, that felt really good. Okay, so we're going second here. And yeah, pretty happy to keep this. We've got early interaction, Consider to filter, and also Brazen Borrower acts as both interaction and the threat itself as well, which is pretty nice. So yeah, definitely going to be keeping this one, and then, you know, we can either Fatal Push or Consider on turn 1. If we do Consider, we're definitely looking for more lands, right? We obviously want to hit our 4th land to be able to curve Borrower into the One Ring, depending on what we're up against here. Okay, so Shocked in Blood Crypt into Thoughtseize, so probably against a mid-range deck here, and I imagine they're going to be taking the One Ring from this hand. You know, Thoughtseize is one of their only tools to be able to stop the One Ring before it resolves. Yeah, okay, so they take the One Ring, going to shock in the Watery Grave here and then just ship it back. If they do play a threat, we might be forced to use the Fatal Push here, but I would like to consider to keep finding land drops here. Okay, nothing on turn 2 is great to see, so we'll consider, probably going to bin anything that isn't a land at this point. Okay, we do find the third land, which is great. And the Make Disappear is really nice as well. So that gives us an answer to opposing One Rings if they have that. And then even if they go for a Crucius here, we've got both Heartless Act and Brazen Borrower. Wow, okay, Dreadhold Arcanist, okay, interesting. Not one that I was expecting, but that is kind of scary with Thoughtseize in the graveyard. I am going to use Fatal Push here because I feel like I want to save the Heartless Act for a potential Crucius. And then I'm going to play the Pathway as the land here, just in case, you know, if we keep drawing lands, it would potentially be nice to have this Otawara to use as a piece of interaction. Okay, nothing from the opponent. I wonder what they've got in hand. Maybe they just got creature removal, which might make flashing in the Borrower here a little bit risky, because it unlocks a lot of their hand. Wow, Spitefield Hazard. I guess that's another hit for their Arcanist. Okay, One Ring, sick top deck here. So we get to resolve that. I mean, unfortunately, that does give the opponent a window to resolve their own one. And okay, we got away with that. I was going to say use it. I was kind of tempted to wait for the One Ring until the opponent's turn. Oh wow, they just scoop it up. But yeah, using the One Ring during our turn there, when they potentially have a Bowmasters, could be risky. We didn't see Bowmasters, and they're running Arcanists, so they could obviously be running Bowmasters, but I'm going to swap it out for Change the Equation, because since we have seen Arcanist, Change the Equation is very good against that, and also Change the Equation can stop their Bowmasters as well. So, happy to make that change now, although, to be honest, Change the Equation on the draw isn't that good at stopping Arcanist or Bowmasters, really, because, you know, we only have 1 mana going into their turn 2. But I still generally think I prefer Change the Equation in the matchup overall, because it is another way for us to stop Crucius, Jarsul. I guess they're not running green, so we don't have to worry about that. But, like, you know, Season Pyromancer, Fable, stuff like that. Whereas Bowmasters is only really good against opposing Bowmasters. So opponent does manage to get an Arcanist in play, which is going to be kind of scary if they do have discard spells here. But we do have Heartless Act if they do, so... Okay, they're just attacking without having anything in the graveyard, which is... You know, not something we're concerned about, so just going to let them attack here. Okay, Fable we're definitely going to counter, right. That's something that even with creature removal, they can 2-for-1 us with, so... Okay, and we draw Archmage's Charm, which is really nice. So I'm going to play out the island just so we don't take damage off the Underground River unnecessarily here. Okay, again, very happy to see them attacking without having anything in the graveyard to recast off the Arcanist. Okay, they do go for Crucius. I'm just going to use Heartless Act here. Again, I really want to save Archmage's Charm for their One Rings, because that's by far and away the best way to interact with it. So, going to use the Heartless Act on the Crucius. Again, I don't really care about the Arcanist as long as they haven't got anything to flash back from the graveyard with. And now we've got Snapcaster Mage online now as well, so definitely happy to see a slightly slower start from the opponent. And it is kind of awkward for them to sideboard against us, because they do kind of need to keep in creature removal against us, but it's also not very good against us in a lot of situations. So here, I think, even though this does leave us very vulnerable to Bowmasters, I'm going to just draw 2 off the Archmage's Charm. I think flashing in the Snapcaster Mage to kill Arcanist while they have nothing in the graveyard isn't really that good. And doing this, going into our turn 5, means that next turn we can have Snapcaster into Archmage's Charm available, which is pretty nice. So I'm going to go for Consider here. The opponent does have priority for something, but I feel like if they had Bowmasters, they would have used it in response to the Archmage's Charm. But now I feel pretty good about the spot, right? We have Snapcaster Mage with a plethora of options in the graveyard. We've got Brazen Borrower that we can, you know, we could cast both sides of the Brazen Borrower if we need. We've also got Make Disappear, so I feel pretty good about this spot. Just trying to think what the opponent could have. They must have a handful of creature removal for them to develop this slowly, right? And thankfully, because we've played quite slowly to the board this game, that hasn't really done much. They do have Season Pyromancer, which I think I'm just going to counter with Archmage's Charm here, right? If they do have a handful of creature removal, that is not only a way for them to unlock their hand, but also a way for them to flood the board pretty quickly. And since we are generally reliant on single target removal, having to deal with tokens is pretty annoying. I mean, yeah, especially when we've cut the Bowmasters from the deck as well. Okay, they do have Fatal Push, so that, yeah, makes me think they probably just did have a lot of creature interaction in hand. So... I think I'm going to run out the Underground River here and then just ship it back. The opponent does have access to Castle Lockthwaite now, and we don't have Bowmasters to punish that. But again, they don't have any discard spells in the graveyard, so they're not going to get any value off the Arcanist here. So again, I think we can just let the Arcanist attack without doing anything about it. And then, see what they cast in phase 2. It's a little bit annoying we don't have a hard counter now. Yeah, so Fable is pretty annoying. We don't have a good way to stop that now, which is, kind of annoying. I mean, thankfully we can bounce the token with the Brazen Borrower and then flash the Borrower in, but that was the risk of using Snapcaster Mage for the hard counter there. We don't have a good way to stop Fable, and it's approaching the point now where we don't have a good way to stop the One Ring either. I mean, thankfully, since we're going to be flashing in the Borrower now, we can potentially casualty the Make disappear, but... Oh, okay. I was going to say using that to counter a One Ring isn't ideal because Borrower is one of our main threats. We do have the Hall of Storm Giants, but now that we've drawn another Archmage's Charm, I feel pretty safe now. I mean, having said that, they are going to get a flipped Reflection, but we should be winning this race. We do have an answer to the Hive. They Thoughtseize. That's pretty annoying because then they can flash back the Thoughtseize with the Arcanist as well. So definitely a consideration here to Heartless Act the Arcanist. I'm going to draw 2 off the Archmage's Charm first though. Hope they don't have a Bowmasters here. Okay, we drew and changed the equation. So now we can change the equation to Thoughtseize. And I think we're probably forced to Heartless Act the Dreadhorde Arcanist, which does give them a window to potentially resolve something. If they have... Okay, I was going to say, if they have a One Ring here, we're kind of in trouble. But thankfully we know they don't have it anymore, so we can Heartless Act the Arcanist. And, I mean, we still have to deal with the Reflection here, so we're definitely not out of the woods. Plus, as I said, we're reliant on single target removal, so without the Bowmasters... Oh, okay. We just drew the One Ring. I was going to say, without Bowmasters, we're kind of going to struggle against the tokens from Seasoned Pyromancer. So maybe we're supposed to keep the Bowmasters in. Bowmasters is particularly good against Pyromancer, not only because of the tokens, but we can also flash it in response to the ETB trigger. So maybe you're just supposed to never cut Bowmasters against midrange. I'm not actually sure the optimal way to sideboard in that matchup. So I was going to save Otawara, potentially to deal with one of the tokens, but with a One Ring in play, we're going to be drawing cards, so I'd rather have the mana available to cast the cards that we draw. But yeah, still definitely figuring out the sideboard plan against midrange, because Bowmasters is a weird one where it's really good against Pyromancer, really good against One Ring, but not good against the rest of the deck. So they have Crucius. I mean, I'm happy to just burn 2 Make Disappears on that one. We're going to be drawing multiple cards per turn. Without Crucius, the chances of them drawing dead go up quite a lot, so definitely happy to use 2 counter spells there. So we get to draw again with the One Ring. Okay, Borrow is not a bad one for sure, but I mean, we really don't want to be bouncing Reflection and give them another Fable here. I mean, we do have access to Hall of Storm Giants, so them attacking is quite risky. Yeah, they don't attack because they're worried about us firing up the Hall. So I think we're just going to flash in the Brazen Borrower here. I mean, again, I would like to save it for a token or two. We don't want to use it to bounce the Reflection like I just said, but we do just want to start closing the game out. Okay, opponent just scoops it up. I mean, we did have an active One Ring, so it kind of makes sense. Okay, so on the play here, and yeah, I think I'm pretty happy to keep this one. If I was going second, I think maybe a little bit too slow because we have a lot of 3-mana interaction. Although having said that, I think in the dark I'd probably keep this going second as well. Okay, interesting. So Steam Vents from the opponent probably means Izzet Wizards, if I had to guess. Or maybe a control deck. Oh, wow. Okay, Thing in the Ice is not very good when we've got Heartless Act. That's potentially an issue. I mean, to be honest, okay, we drew Fatal Push, so that's fine now, but since we're probably not going to have any creatures in play when it flips anyway, we could just wait for the opponent to flip it and then kill it with Heartless Act. But now we got Fatal Push. I think it's fine. So, Thing in the Ice makes me think we must be against Phoenix. Okay, they've got a second Thing in the Ice. I mean, I think I'm going to counter that. Just because, Heartless Act isn't particularly good. We've already got Fatal Push for one. We don't really have a good answer for the other. Interesting whether I want to play the Island or the Darkslick Shores here. I think I'm going to play the Island just so that we have the option to go Archmage's Charm plus Fatal Push here. So they use an opt. Yeah, just double checking that Fatal Push can still kill the backside of it. I'm pretty sure it can. So interesting matchup. I've not played Phoenix with this deck so far, but I feel like it's probably a worse matchup than Wizards, because they obviously, you know, bringing back Phoenix repeatedly is going to be a lot more difficult to deal with than Wizards. You know, Wizards has felt like a really good matchup from this deck because we have so many, you know, we have such good quality single target interaction, particularly post sideboard where we bring cut down as well. Okay, they're just passing, so I think I'm just going to use Fatal Push here, kill the thing in the ice, and then we've still got Heartless Act up for any of their other threats. You know, Dragon's Rage Channeler, they're just shredded, that sort of thing. And then I'm kind of tempted to draw 2 off the Archmage's Charm here because we've still got Snapcaster Mage to counter something else. I do kind of want to keep the cards flowing here as well. You know, make the use of our mana while we can. Because counter spells generally aren't as effective against Phoenix, particularly, you know, if they go like Faithless Suiting into a spell into another spell. Countering any of those individually isn't really that powerful. Although using it to steal something like a Dragon's Rage Channeler is pretty good, so... And there is a Faithless Looting, so hopefully they don't have 2 Phoenixes here. That'll be pretty rough. I mean, saying that, we do have 2 Cling to Dust in the main deck, which is obviously very good against them. They do have an Ox of Agonis, so... That's going to be a bit of an issue because, again, that's another creature that once they escape it, Heartless Act isn't particularly good against. But this matchup isn't very common, so I still think on balance it's probably better to run Heartless Act over Go for the Throat, because I definitely see more artifact decks than I do Phoenix or even humans now because of Bowmaster. So we'll Fatal Push the thing in the ice here. Oh, wow. Okay, Bowmasters is sick. I'm just going to flash this in now before they get any more value off the Channeler. Taking out the Channeler with the Bowmasters is sick. You know, even if they get Delirium online here, it doesn't turn into a 3-3, so we don't even have to worry about that, which is really nice. And Bowmasters seems sick against them, right? If this sticks on the battlefield, so much of their deck involves drawing a card. So, yeah, this seems like a matchup where Bowmasters are going to be putting in work. We'll have to see that. I mean, I'm sure they've got a lot of removal, so if they do have a Fiery Impulse or something, that's going to be the first card to die. Wow, they're running Gandalf Sanction. Okay, interesting. So that's a card we do need to be wary of for sure, right? That can potentially just one-shot us. That's a card that I've been, you know, wanting to test for quite a while, actually. The card seems very strong. I mean, thankfully they also have Ox of Agonis, so if they do end up escaping the Ox here, then that means their future Gandalf Sanctions are going to be a lot less powerful. But since they did kill the Bowmasters, them drawing 3 off, you know, they're not going to get punished for drawing 3 off the Ox, which is a little bit annoying here. So it looks like they are escaping the Ox. I can see them mousing over the graveyard. So that does, you know, that is going to be a problem if they have Phoenixes in hand. Again, Heartless Axe can't kill it. We really don't want to be bouncing the Ox if we can avoid it, but I kind of feel like we don't have a better option here. This feels pretty rough to do, but like I feel like we have to start applying pressure. Okay, we did draw a counter spell, which is obviously very good. Maybe that's wrong, but I feel like if they have an Ox in play, not only can we not attack to apply pressure, I mean, we can attack with the Borrow. We could have just flashed in the Borrower as a threat, but we also don't really have great ways to defend against the 5-3 because Heartless Axe can't kill it, right? If that Heartless Axe was to go for the Throat, I think we just kill the Ox. Although again, they've got a Phoenix in the graveyard, that's a bit rough, but Ox is generally worse for them in hand than in graveyard anyway, so maybe bouncing it isn't the worst. Although they do have Faithless Looting, so they can just pitch it, yeah. So they do pitch the Ox of Agonis. Okay, and another thing in the ice, so we could counter that with the Make Disappear potentially, but I'm not really too concerned about Thing in the Ice, to be honest. So I think what I'm going to do instead is just bounce it, because they're so far away from it becoming a proper threat. Even if they do flip it, we get a Snapcaster Mage back to our hand, which isn't actually, you know, that's actually beneficial for us. So we could use Heartless Act on the Channeler here, which maybe is better to do because they do block. Actually, yeah, thinking about it, I probably should have done. Although, if they play like a Crackling Drake, I'll definitely regret that. Although, again, we have Make Disappear with Casualty, so maybe I'm supposed to just Heartless Act there and attack to put them on a faster clock. Yeah, thinking about it, I think that probably would have been better. I just moved too quickly there. So yeah, in hindsight, I probably should have just killed the Channeler. Then they'd have been on 7. We'd have still had a Brazen Borrow in play. Okay, they go for Gandalf Sanction up. Thankfully, we have a counter spell for the finale here, so... So actually thinking about it, even if we had killed the Channeler with the Heartless Act, we still wouldn't have had lethal here. Unless we happen to draw a Fatal Push right now. Actually, no, wait, we would have done, right? They would have been on 7. Yeah. We would have had lethal. So yeah, I think it was definitely a misplay for me not to Heartless Act the Dragon's Rage Channeler a couple turns ago. That was my bad. I was playing a little bit too quickly. And now they have, they can potentially escape the Ox again, I assume. They must have a lot of cards in the graveyard. I mean, thankfully we have the Bowmasters here to kind of punish that. Okay, they do get enough sanction the Brazen Borrow. So yeah, I definitely misplayed. I definitely should have killed the Channeler with the Heartless Act. Because if they are running Thing in the Ice and Ox, we don't really have good targets for the Heartless Act outside of Channeler. Unless they're running like a Crackling Drake or a Ledger Shredder as well. But I feel like Phoenix decks can't afford to run that many threats. So we're definitely going to be flashing the Orcish Bowmasters in response to the Ox trigger here. Going to go face first. And then... Okay, it looks like they don't have a removal spell for it, which is great. So now, what do we want to go face or do we want to kill the Ox? I think I want to kill the Ox. And then that allows us to more freely attack. And now, even if they do flip the Thing in the Ice, we have the Heartless Act to be able to kill it. And we would get both Snapcaster Mage and Bowmasters back into our hand, which is a good thing for us. So, well, they consider... I mean, that's another trigger for the Bowmasters. I guess they're just trying to flip the Thing in the Ice. But yeah, we wouldn't even have to worry about this had I not misplayed earlier, right? I should have definitely killed the Channeler and we would have had lethal by now. So we get to go face with the Bowmasters again. I mean, I presume they must have another spell to flip the Thing in the Ice here. Yeah, they go for Consider again. So we put them down to 3. They bounce the Bowmasters back to our hand. And we can just flash in the Bowmasters in response. Which puts them down to 2, presumably. Ah, they also have Fiery Impulse, okay. Well, either way, I'm going to Heartless Act the Awoken Horror. We get a token regardless, right? It puts them down to 3. And now we have a Snapcaster Mage back in our hand as well for Archmage's Charm. They do get the Phoenix back as well, though. So, yeah, I definitely made this game a lot harder for myself than I needed to because I didn't kill that Channeler. Wow, they go aggressive. That's that's ballsy. So, I kind of want to Snapcaster Mage Archmage's Charm now. I mean, maybe that's really risky in case they have a finale, but... if I can find another Bowmasters, we can just win on the spot here. Okay, find another Snapcaster Mage. We are tapped out of counter spells now, but we do have this Hall here as well, so... Maybe that was a little bit risky, but if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have drawn the Hall to be able to threaten lethal next turn. Okay, opponent goes for Faithless Looting. I mean, if they hit triple... I mean, even if they have triple Phoenix here, we still survive. Okay, there's a second Phoenix. So yeah, I made this game a lot more difficult for myself than I needed to. But having that Hall of Storm Giants is a lethal threat, as is the Snapcaster Mage here as well. So if the opponent... Oh, wow. Hold on. Are we dead here? We take 3... Wow, they're 1 short of lethal. So if we'd have lost this, it would have been a big punt on my part. So interesting. If they attack here, we win because we can just flash in the Snapcaster Mage. Wow, they choose not to. Interesting. So do we want to wait on the Snapcaster Mage? Probably yes, we do, I think. Because now we can hold the Snapcaster. Trying to think how much mana we've got. I don't think we can afford to attack with the Hall here because... then we don't have access to Snapcaster Mage for next time. I feel like we're forced to Snapcaster Mage counter the Ox here, potentially. Because I imagine that's what they'll do next turn. But yeah, we obviously should have won this a while back if I'd Heartless Act the Channeler. But I still feel pretty good, unless they happen to draw something insanely good here. We should just go Snapcaster Mage, counter the Ox. And then, they can't really attack here either because we have the Hall of Storm Giants. So they exile their whole graveyard here, so we can just flash in the Snapcaster Mage, counter the Ox, so now they can't escape it again. So hopefully the last card they've drawn isn't something crazy impactful here. I'm going to set stops just to bluff something. Wow, they had Faithless Looting into Phoenix. I mean, thankfully they can't get the Phoenix back, right? Because whatever they hit off the Faithless Looting is just going to go straight to the graveyard. But I guess they just want to fill up their graveyard for the Ox. Wow, they just attack. Okay, sweet. Okay, we should have won that a while back, but ended up getting there in the end anyway. So, against Phoenix, what do we want in here? Change the Equation seems pretty good, as does Cling to Dust as extra graveyard hate. Mystical Dispute is also a consideration here. Okay, what's not great? I mean, I feel like Change the Equation basically just is better than Make Disappear in this matchup. Hits basically everything in their deck and doesn't have the conditional clause. And then Cut Down also seems pretty good, right? It hits Phoenix, it hits Chandler, it hits Thing in the Ice. I think it's better than Heartless Act. You know, we saw last game Heartless Act really isn't that great here. So I think I'm going to run it back like that, honestly. Looks pretty good overall to me. And yeah, I mean, that felt pretty good as a matchup overall. I think I did misplace slightly with that not killing the Chandler, but we have Cling to Dust is really good against Phoenix specifically. Change the Equation seems really good against basically their entire deck. I think the only card they could run that it wouldn't hit is Storming Entity, which I've not seen in ages, so I very much doubt they're running that. You know, like I said, Phoenix can't afford to run that many threats, so I'm pretty sure we saw most of the threats they're running. Bowmasters also seems incredibly good in this matchup as well. So I'm going to run out the Underground River first, just to not, you know, if we shock in the Watery Grave, it's pretty obvious that we have something. Okay, the Thing in the Ice, I'm just going to use Cut Down here. Okay, we draw Fatal Push, interesting. So, I think I am going to shock in the Watery Grave. Maybe I should have done that last time. I guess we could have also played the Pathway here, but then if we end up having to flash in the Bowmasters, we take a damage off the Underground River anyway, so... Wow, they go for Faithless Looting. I mean, we're definitely going to flash in the Bowmasters in response. Even if they have Phoenix here, they would need to kill the Bowmasters immediately, or we, you know, deal them a lot of damage, make a big token. Okay, so they go for Consider. That makes me think they can't have a removal spell here. So we deal them on with the Bowmasters, and they draw 2 off the Looting, which, you know, get 2 extra pings off the Bowmasters, make a 3/3 token as well. They do have a Phoenix in the yard, so if they have another spell, they can bring that back again. But if it's a draw spell, the Bowmasters is really going to punish them here. Okay, Opt. So, I mean, I feel like Phoenix has been falling off for a while. I do feel like it's better against the interactive decks than Wizards, but with the printing of Bowmasters, I feel like it might just be the, you know, the end of Phoenix, because Bowmasters seems so good against it, and Bowmasters does seem pretty commonly played right now, you know, specifically in the mid-range shells. So having the One Ring here seems pretty good. Okay, there's Chandler as well, so we have Fatal Push. We could also flash, you know, go Snapcaster Mage, flash back the Cut Down as well. Wow, Blue Sun's Twilight steal the 4/4. Okay, interesting. So, I mean, that's not too much of an issue because we have the Fatal Push, so we can go, you know, maybe Snapcaster Mage, flash back the Cut Downs to kill the Chandler, and then still hold on to Fatal Push for the 4/4 here. Which seems pretty reasonable to me. We could also go Snapcaster Mage, flash back the Cut Down, kill the Chandler, and then just cast the One Ring next turn. Now, that would get punished by Spell Pierce exactly, but I don't know. I feel like it might be worth the risk, right? They need exactly Spell Pierce, and if they don't, then we're going to start running away with the game in terms of card advantage. And I quite like that because it basically blanks the 4/4 and the 3/2. We do kind of get punished by Spell Pierce if they did have it, but I feel like it's worth the risk, right? The alternative is just push the 4/4, cut down the Phoenix, which doesn't seem amazing to me. And we get to freely attack here as well, which puts them down to 8, which, you know, Phoenix doesn't have any life gain at all, so... But yeah, now we get to untap with the Ring. I mean, we are taking damage off it, but We have 3 Cling to Dust post sideboard, and we obviously have 3 more copies of One Ring to Legend Rule it, so that's not really a concern. And the more cards we draw, the less likely it is the opponent's ever going to be able to mount any kind of offense against us as well. The fact they didn't do anything last turn is kind of concerning though, makes me think they must have quite a lot of instant speed stuff. Okay, they do have an impulse for the Bowmasters, so that basically unlocks all of their cantrips now. Let's see what else they've got here. Okay, they do have I mean, we could consider to try and find another Bowmasters, but that seems unnecessarily greedy, I think. Well, having said that, we're probably going to want to consider anyway, so maybe I should have done just in case we hit it. Not 100% sure. Wow, they Gandalf sanctioned the Snapcaster Mage. I feel like we have to kill our own Snapcaster Mage here, because we're effectively at 8 off the One Ring anyway. So we'd be going down to 3. We'd probably just die to our own One Ring if we didn't do that. So now we just pushed the 4/4, and I think we're probably forced to cut down the Phoenix as well here. So definitely not out of the woods yet, but having an active One Ring in place should make a big difference here. Okay, Fatal Push. I think we should probably keep that, right? Kills Chandler, kills Thing in the Ice. Okay, Change the Equation is also a good one. We do kind of want to dig towards a Cling to Dust or a second ring here, but I feel like we've got enough looks here. And even if we stop drawing now, we still have 2 turns to find it naturally anyway, and we do have a lot of cantrips here. Okay, they do have a Crackling Drake, but we have changed the equation here, which I think I prefer using to Archmage's Charm. Okay, opponent just keeps it up. So sweet, we got that. That matchup did feel pretty good, especially because of Bowmasters. Okay, so we're going second here. And yeah, pretty happy with this. Right, we've got Terminal Interaction, turn 2 Make Disappear, which is really important going second against a lot of decks. Okay, Plaza into Chromatic Star, so definitely against Kethis combo here, which has felt pretty good overall, right? We've got a lot of early interaction, and counter spells in particular is very good against them, unless they have Delighted Halfling, but we have a lot of, ways to kill the Halfling anyway, so... Well, nothing on turn 2. Very happy to see that. Although, having said that, they could easily play like a Kinnan or something, but we have the Fatal Push for it. So, I think in general, I'm trying to save the Make Disappear for Kethis itself. I'd rather use the Fatal Push on their other creatures if possible. And then, yeah, just use the Make Disappear to stop the Kethis itself. Or also Jace as well is another pretty big one to be able to counter. So, pretty happy to see a slow start. I feel like we definitely have the inevitability as the game goes long. Even though they can sometimes cast multiple spells in a turn in the early game off the Mox Amber and the Relic of Legends, I feel like, we have so much cheap interaction that we should just be able to stop them doing whatever they're trying to do. Even though I said I would like to keep the Make Disappear for, a Jace or a Kethis, since we have the Snapcaster Mage to flash it back, and Fatal Push, it's hard for us to trigger Revolt. I feel like I'm happy to use the Make Disappear on the Emery now, and then we can always just, if they do try to cast a Kethis or a Jace, we can always just go Snapcaster Mage, flash it back, and then obviously we've now drawn Archmage's Charm as well, so... Even though we have the One Ring here, I think it's very important to not give them a window to combo. I feel like that's the biggest mistake you can do, right? If you go Shields down, all they need is one turn, right? They can easily just go like Kethis into Jace, just combo off out of nowhere, so definitely going to be playing carefully in the early game here. And this is a good window for us to go Snapcaster Mage, Make Disappear for sure. Then we can attack with the Snapcaster Mage. Again, we could jam the One Ring, but I feel like holding open Archmage's Charm here is going to be very important. Right, again, as I mentioned, they can easily just combo off out of nowhere, so... Thoughtseize is pretty annoying here. I think I'm just going to counter the Thoughtseize. And then if they do have Kethis, that's kind of awkward, but I feel like they're taking... I don't know, maybe I'm supposed to let them see there, but taking the Thoughtseize means that if they do play a 2-drop... okay, we can't Fatal Push the Emery, unfortunately, but... I mean, we're kind of in a spot now where we're effectively shields down anyway, right? We don't have any more counter spells. So getting the One Ring here, we could potentially draw a counter spell, like a Make Disappear or something, which would be pretty big. So here, this is kind of annoying because it does potentially give them a turn to combo off, but... Well, I mean, they would need Jace of Mysteries to win this turn because we have protection from the One Ring. So the One Ring's protection does prevent them from killing us this turn if they don't have Jace Wielder, which we know they don't have because they're running Gigantha. But that's still not great because even if they can't kill us, they could still effectively play one of every single legendary card in their deck if they get to go off with Kethis. But they haven't really filled up the graveyard too much. We've killed one of their Jaces, so even if they have Kethis here, I don't really think it's enough to go off. So we basically just have to hope they don't have a crazy combo turn this turn, and then we'll be drawing a card off Consider. We'll be drawing 2 cards off the One Ring. I feel like that should be good enough to stabilize our board state here. Wow, they just go for Takenuma. Okay, I'm pretty happy to see that. So I guess they're trying to dig for... I was going to say they can try and dig for Kethis or get a Jace back. Guess it makes sense they're going for Halfling though, because that then shuts off our counter spells, which is our main way to win in this matchup. But thankfully we have the Fatal Push already in hand to be able to kill it. So we can kill the Halfling, which then, you know, opens up our counter spells again. Then we can Consider. And we're basically just digging towards counter spells at this point, I think. Okay, perfect. Snapcaster Mage basically counts as a counter spell because we've already got 2 in grave. And then we get to draw 2 off the One Ring. We also drew Heartless Act, which is really nice. Wow, and another Heartless Act. So I'm going to attack first just to see if they take the trade. If they don't, I'm kind of debating going for Heartless Act now, but the risk going for Heartless Act is then we don't have access to Snapcaster Mage into Archmage's Charm, which feels really important here because I guess we would have had Snapcaster Mage into Make Disappear actually, so maybe it's best to kill the Emery here, and then we can still go Snap, Make Disappear, sacrificing one of these Snapcaster Mages to the casualty on that, but I still feel this is fine, right? Even if they get back a Relic of Legends, I'm not too bothered because we can just bounce it with the Brazen Borrower. So I don't think that's worth countering, right? They could potentially cast another creature here. And to be honest, it's getting to the point where we can just kill them. You know, if we flash in the Brazen Borrower and the Snapcaster Mage, then the opponent's basically dead here. Okay, so they tap to go for another Emery, so we should just win, right? We can flash in the Snapcaster Mage to either push the Kinnan or, you know, just get a Consider. So yeah, we can just go to end step, well, Snapcaster Mage, Brazen Borrower, and then just kill them. Like we obviously can't kill the Emery with the Fatal Push, but we can kill the Emery with the Heartless Act here, so I guess it doesn't really matter. We don't even really need to kill the Kinnan here. It doesn't really matter. So we can now just kill the Emery with the Heartless Act and then just kill them. So managed to turn the corner pretty quickly there. That's why I like Brazen Borrower, because it does allow you to just, you know, close games out a lot quicker. So against Kethis, I think this is a matchup where we want additional counter spells. Change the Equation is very good against them. It doesn't hit Jace, which is a bit annoying, but... And then I feel like this is a matchup where we really want Cut Down as well, specifically because of Halfling. We do rely quite heavily on counter spells in this matchup, so I do like having Cut Down here. Bowmasters isn't really that great. And I don't know, Cling to Dust isn't amazing either, but I feel like we do need some incidental life gain to go along with the One Ring. And it is obviously good against specifically Emery as well. I feel like we can just trim, you know, not 100% sure what the best cuts are, so just going to trim a Brazen Borrower, trim a couple of Change the Equations, I think, and then probably trim a Cut Down as well. So we probably, because we have, you know, a big selection of cards for different matchups, we do probably have too much stuff to bring in everything here, but I do feel like we have really good tools to win this matchup. You know, this is one of the big reasons why I'm a big fan of this deck right now. I feel like it's good against Kethis, good against Revels, you know, good against One Ring decks in general, although, you know, Rakdos and Jund can be a bit of a coin flip depending on how their interaction lines up, but this deck does feel relatively well positioned against a lot of the decks that are probably the scariest combo decks in the format, right? You know, the Samwise decks also are pretty scary as well, and I feel like, you know, from my experience in those matchups, it feels pretty good because we have counter spells and so much cheap interaction as well. So this hand is a little bit annoying. It's a hand where we don't, you know, we're reliant on the pathway for black mana right now. Okay, they do have Kinnan. We'll let that resolve. Hopefully they don't have an Amber. Okay, no Mox Amber is great to see. Really hoping to find a black land here. Then we don't have to worry about the pathway. Okay, sick. So we do find a black land. That's really good. Now we can have triple blue up for Archmage's Charm and still have access to Cut Down here. So it's definitely an argument to killing the Kinnan here, but I feel like having Make Disappear available this turn, particularly when they could go Kethis, is important. So Halfling, we could counter this. Maybe we should as well. I'm not sure. Because I feel like if they had the third land, they know we're playing Make Disappear, they probably would have played it. Either way, we definitely need to kill the Halfling. Okay, opponent just scoops up. I mean, they did Multi 5, and this is a pretty good matchup for us overall. Probably a bit of an early concession though, but we'll take it.